Good morning. It is Friday, January 29th. I'm Jason Stanton. I serve as senior pastor at First Lutheran in Onalaska. This is my morning musing for today. We continue, or I do anyway, with the 21-day racial equity challenge at First Lutheran. We're on day 12. And the question for today is, how do we preach a word that challenges racism and addresses the pain that communities of color are experiencing? Reverend Dr. Otis Moss offers a sermon called "We Shall Overcome Someday" on the killing of George Floyd for his congregation, Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, and then it gives the YouTube address to watch and listen to the sermon. One of the gifts that I've heard of COVID time, I've heard about this from many of you, is many of you enjoy not just catching up with your own church, but tuning in to hear how other churches do worship and what other pastors are preaching into this COVID moment. And I think for churches that are predominantly white, like most of you that are watching me, our churches have been, rightly so, tied up with the challenges that have come with the pandemic and all the political and partisan stuff that tries to divide us and tear us apart. And so we've been really speaking into, and then we've got all those personal things that are happening to us as well. There's so many issues, problems, challenges to talk about and to offer God's good news into. How does a white church talk about and speak into the racial equity challenges, the issues of our day? The George Floyd killing, as well as so many others that had happened so recently up to that moment, and then others followed after. But that moment last summer, I think, clarified for a lot of people that, okay, something has to happen, has to change, even maybe in me, that I need to become more aware of what's going on here. Obviously, these aren't just everybody agrees kinds of conversations, but they're conversations that need to happen. So this sermon comes from then, the week after George Floyd died, to my understanding. And he starts, I'm just going to give like a book report on the sermon. It's not going to be nearly as good as the sermon itself, so I still invite you to listen to, what was his name, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss. I want you to hear Pastor Moss's sermon, but let me just give you some pieces as to what you can expect, because I find it so helpful as one who stands outside the community who is being harmed. And then to recognize, actually, I don't necessarily stand outside that community because they're a part of our whole nation's community. And that's the piece that I think many of us might be missing. We still think of these things in terms of, well, that's their problem. And although I sympathize and my heart goes out to them, in this case, people of color, but we do this a lot with all kinds of different stuff. Like, yeah, I'm so sad for them, whoever them is in whatever situation, but then we don't really think that affects us. Racial equity affects all of us, and we're all missing out. But especially, of course, it affects those people of color. And so he asks, Pastor Moss does, he asks, when is someday? You know, there's a famous, beloved spiritual, "We shall overcome someday." And he's asking, when is someday? He says, "I believe a day will come when justice reigns. But when? How many bodies will have to break? What else do we need to speak with authority on the subject of unjust violence rooted in racism?" That's a compelling question. After George Floyd's killing, I asked the same question. What would people need? What more could you possibly see to understand that this is a problem? We might disagree on how to respond to that problem, but it is a problem worth talking about, not just ignoring because it's not really our problem. He says, Pastor Moss says, we're called to do more than pray. This nation has a spiritual defect. We need a spiritual revolution, a moral revival. I echoed this a couple weeks ago in a sermon I preached that, we used to have understood moral values. Now we all live more likely in political values. We might even say we agree with this or that one year, and 20 years later, we're on the complete opposite side because our political party has jumped ship and moved to the opposite side. It's like we wonder what our party might say before we think about, well, what's the moral right here? Pastor Moss says, I love our Black church tradition. We have always had access to the greatest power. That's the part they've always named, probably more than anything, perhaps, is that amidst all the challenges, all the persecution, they still are always given complete and total access to the power of God. And so he says, in this moment, I love this, don't ask, where is God? The question is, where are you? That's a powerful note to me when I'm feeling sorry for myself in situations far less challenging than being a person of color in the wake of George Floyd's killing. Oftentimes, many of us, I think, have perhaps wondered, where is God? Don't ask that. The question is, where are you? And then he lists off like 10 or 12 famous people in the Black tradition that have fought: Harriet, Sojourner, Frederick, and then he lists a bunch more. They answered when God asked, where are you? Will you answer? We have the power to build a movement for our children and our children's children. And again, I would suggest that that's a message to white people as much as his congregation. So then he makes a list of, what would a movement look like? What does that mean? And I think that's where I get stuck. Like, okay, yeah, something needs to be done. A moral revolution. Well, how does that happen? Give your clergy the space to speak. Whatever groups you're involved with. Let's say you're in a fraternity or a sorority, or you're in a union. This is our chance to unify and cry together. Get your leaders in that fraternity or sorority or that union to speak out against what's happened and to stand collectively so that everyone is on the same page here. If you're an artist, inspire us. Don't just sell your art. Pour your giftedness into that art that it may help be a part of this movement. If you're a business owner, have your business speak into this moment. You can stand with those who've lost. Comfortable people. I mean, he really goes after this. Comfortable people. Your wealth, you need to understand, was negotiated in the crucible of pain. So stand with the uncomfortable. Politician, have the courage to speak against the wrong. Join the movement. I mean, basically he's saying it's a movement because of its breadth. If everybody speaks out against it, against having someone kill someone in broad daylight simply because of their race, like if that can happen, we all need to speak out against that. And he says, we're in a state of emergency. We can't hide from this moment. When is someday? And then his last words are, we should all seek to build someday today. That speaks to me as well, because I don't care if it's about this issue in particular, or a lot of us talk about someday all the time. Someday I'm going to lose weight. Someday I'm going to forgive that person that pained me. Someday I'm going to care about that thing I know I'm supposed to care about. What if we started building someday today? Keep faith alive.